Welcome, everyone, to our NCAA Social Series. I'm Andy Katz. For this episode, we are going to discuss the transfer portal. A new term has been thrown out. I am not claiming it. It's called portaling because plenty of student athletes across all sports have done it. And I'm pleased to be joined by Susan Peal. She is the Director of Governance with certainly a hyper focus on the transfer portal. And Lydia Bell, she is the Associate Director of Research, both at the NCAA. So I want to go back, take us to the present and where we're going, because there's been a lot of changes, certainly in the 30 years. Yes, I'm dating myself, the 30 years that I've covered college athletics on transferring, from sitting out to you couldn't within your conference to a 4.24. I mean, all the numbers that were thrown around in the past about transferring. So let's go back a little about sort of the history of transferring. Susan and Lydia, and you can sort of chime in and have a conversation about this, about where did this initially, this sort of wave, when did it really start to where it was acceptable to transfer within the guardrails of the NCAA?
All right, I'll go ahead and start out. Thank you, Andy. I think it is important to go back in history when talking about the transfer portal, because if we go back to 2018, that is when the NCAA legislation for Division I did change from permission to contact to notification of transfer. So what does that mean? Well, at that time when we were under the permission to contact legislation, institutions could deny student athletes that permission to just speak to another coach, or they could go ahead and allow that. And they could even say you can speak to X institution, but not Y institution. So they could pick and choose also. So that was really, the premise of then the change to notification of transfer, which then allowed that student athlete to just say, I am going to talk to this other coach. And the school could not block that in any way. Now, at that time—
Susan, let me interrupt you for 1 second, because I'm glad you brought that up, because there was a point, and I remember this very vividly, where those student athletes, different sports, not just one, would then go public. And the court of public opinion was always on their side. And the coach would stand on that hill and say, you're not going to talk to that, that school. And then eventually would cave. And it became this sort of back and forth in the court of public opinion once that student athlete went public, that ultimately I felt like it had to lead to a change. And I'm curious from your vantage point, and then Lydia, if you can jump in, just how much that did eventually change the tide of the legislation.
Yeah, exactly. And that did change the tide of the legislation. And that's exactly why we do have the transfer portal today, because again, if we were going to, open this up where student athletes could speak to coaches, then how would a coach know that he or she could speak to that student athlete and be in compliance with the legislation of the notification and transfer? So basically, the process was very simple, where the student athlete would notify the compliance administrator, the compliance office at that institution, say, hey, I want my notification of transfer. I want to enter the transfer portal. And the transfer portal really, it's not the legislation, it's the mechanism for our compliance administrators to manage that transfer process from start to finish. And for when the coach looks in the transfer portal to know, all right, I see that name, that means I can speak to that student athlete. I don't see the name, then the student athlete has not requested the notification of transfer. And it really is that simple as far as from the transfer portal side. There's very limited information in that notification of transfer that the coach actually sees. Now, as I mentioned, it's a compliance tool. So there's a wealth of information in the transfer portal that the compliance administrator manages, because that's going to be the individual who ultimately, certifies the eligibility of that student athlete, and they need everything from academic history to participation history to know how many seasons remaining. Did the student transfer previously? Just a lot of information.
Your turn, Lydia.
Well, I think what's really important to what Susan just said, and some misconceptions about the transfer portal, there is, as Susan said, there's a wealth of information, but there's a wealth of information that would benefit a compliance director. There is not athlete stats built into the portal. A coach cannot look at the transfer portal and say that they're looking for a point guard. That's not in the portal. You can't search by position. There is nothing to see minutes per game, or none of that stuff is actually in there. Height and weight, not part of the transfer portal. And I think what's interesting is so often, even just this past week, Jeff Goodman, posted something that had, all the men's basketball players in the transfer portal, and appended to that were names, institutions, and a bunch of stats, height, weight, minutes per game. That's not from the transfer portal. Someone else, appended that, but that's not something that is visible to coaches. And I think that's a huge misconception. The other misconception, as Susan was just saying, that student athletes have to ask to be entered into the transfer portal. They have to meet with compliance, and then that compliance individual has, it's believe it's 72 business hours to enter that student athlete into the transfer portal. A student athlete does not wake up in the middle of the night, decide they don't like their school anymore, and then they just enter themselves. And I think part of the narrative around in the media around the transfer portal is this idea of students entering themselves into the portal as if it's a rash act. And it is a conversation with compliance, and the compliance staff member, that's who enters a student athlete into the portal. Students don't enter or withdraw themselves from the portal. They actually don't have access to the portal itself. It's a compliance tool. So those are two misconceptions I think are really important to really help unpack for people. Because if you just read what's in the media, you might not understand the real mechanisms behind the scenes.
All right, so I do want to sort of dumb it down in a second here, because I want to really just lay it out. But I just want to circle on one quick thing, Susan, is that the transferring within leagues, because I mentioned this at the top, because there was multiple alliteration, there's sort of multiple changes within what was allowed. Help us explain the rules from the membership, i.e. headquarters, if you will, Indy, versus how rules within leagues can be different, and sort of what supersedes, because some leagues still to this day won't let you transfer within, some took some time to change that. So how do you square that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and probably very confusing for the student athlete, because again, when we look at, it's two parts. It's first notification and transfer, being able to actually talk to other coaches, and then it's, can I be immediately eligible upon transfer? And what then eventually years later changed in Division I was the one-time transfer exception to allow for those sports that did not have the one-time transfer exception to take advantage of that. And so that gets to your question. So when the actual transfer rules changed, then it was up to then the conferences to decide, because they had intra-conference rules to decide how they were going to apply that conference policy. And some conferences immediately changed their policy, and they no longer had the restrictions on intra-conference transfers. I'm not sure, how many conferences out there still do have the intra-conference transfer rules.
Yeah, I think, if I'm not mistaken, last time I checked, I think it's either one or two. So it's dwindled down to almost zero. You brought up another great point about this decision process, Lydia. So let's really get at its base. So a player, what I do want to bring back one thing though, because in the discussion of allowing this one-time transfer, I do want to clean this part up. I remember a year or two ago, it was during the pandemic, there was discussion about not allowing freshmen to do this. And I remember Purdue head coach Matt Painter was very adamant about this, that freshmen, they just got there, it's a rash decision. So if both of you can speak to this, just what was the thinking in not even going down that path, to not muddy that up, that just to make it that if you make that decision, and we'll get to the actual steps, you're allowed to do it regardless of your grade?
Well, I think too, and Lydia can jump in. I mean, there were all kinds of concepts being discussed when, the change in the actual transfer legislation to be immediately eligible was proposed. And so, what you just said obviously didn't stick. And, with all of this, there are always legal concerns that you have to look at. Placing restrictions, would we put ourselves at legal risk from a membership standpoint? So I don't know if you have anything, Lydia, because I know that, Lydia was probably involved in the academic side of everything with transferring.
Yeah, the only thing I was going to say is that, undergraduates generally, I mean, if you look at the data for college students across the country, data suggests that about a third of all undergraduates at some point transfer institutions. And the data that we have specific to student athletes, actually, we find that student athletes are less likely to transfer than their non-athlete peers. And that's something that's, true across the three divisions in the NCAA. There are differences by sport, of course, but we do see in general, student athletes are transferring at lower rates.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that typically most students, they're at their best advantage transferring at the end of their freshman year or at the end of their sophomore year, because one of the biggest risks in transferring is that you want to be able to, when at your new institution, there's oftentimes you want to make sure that the credits you have are transferable. And for someone who is, further along in their major, someone who's transferring at the end of their junior year, at many institutions, they're going to have to, take additional classes, to make up for, their current major of choice upon transfer. So it's almost academically beneficial to transfer at the end of your freshman year or at the end of your sophomore year, really thinking about someone's progression and their time to degree. It's actually a smarter suggestion. If I was an advisor to an undergraduate, I would encourage a freshman or a sophomore to consider transfer. I wouldn't be as academically encouraging to a junior or to a senior, especially just because it's really hard to complete your degree when you suddenly have to change schools and take all new courses. So the transfer committee definitely thought about different restrictions about what year in school someone could transfer, but a lot of the data that we had suggested that over 3/4 of student athletes are transferring transferring by the end of their sophomore year. It's much more rare for students to transfer at their junior year or senior year. Graduate transfers aside.
Yeah, and we're going to get to that in a second. I mean, I would just say, as a parent in this stage of life, I can't tell you how many times I come across fellow parents who, their kid went to a big school and they realize it's too big and they want to go to a small school, or vice versa, or they change their majors. So yes, it does happen to the general student body quite a bit. I have plenty of examples just in my life of friends whose kids have ultimately transferred after their freshman or sophomore year, before they're deeper into their major. All right, so let's walk through the steps. Let's start with you, Lydia. I'm a student athlete, regardless of sport. I want to transfer for whatever reason. Playing time, not happy, coaching change, big school, small school, more, you name it. First step, what do I do?
Well, Andy, I'm in research. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to answer that. I think the most important thing before someone is, when they're contemplating transfer, as someone who used to be a faculty member at a campus and I was academic advisor, I think it's really important to ask yourself first, why you're considering transfer, and to really get your information answered before you speak with your compliance director about the idea of entering the transfer portal. Where might you want to go? What kind of degree program are you looking for? What sort of parameters do you want to set for yourself? So I think it needs to be both an academic decision, a personal decision, maybe you chat with your family, but really before you take into account only athletics, I think that's a really important piece, is to really better understand, what are the implications, particularly if you're a student athlete entering the transfer portal. We just published a dashboard yesterday that student athletes or their families, anyone in the public can use to look at, what are the outcomes for student athletes who enter the transfer portal? Because not all student athletes who enter the transfer portal transfer to another NCAA member institution. Some of those students may leave their sport. Some of those students may transfer to a junior college. We obviously can't track them in the portal because it's an NCAA only tool. But for a student athlete who has an athletic scholarship, one of the risks of potentially entering the transfer portal is that the institution can cancel their aid at the end of the academic semester or the academic term. And so for a student to enter the portal, to be really confident that they do want to transfer because they could be, risking their athletics aid. I just think having some of those questions, reviewing, there's a, want to transfer page on the NCAA research site or the NCAA resource site for student athletes. Just think it's very important to better understand the process and the potential risks that are involved when someone does enter the transfer portal. Susan, I'm sure you've got better ideas.
Yeah,
All right, so Susan, walk me through it.
Well, I was just going to say,
That was good, really good information as an overall base. I appreciate that. Thank you, Lydia.
And Lydia said a key word, risk. Our student athletes do have to understand, just like any student, there is a risk in transferring. Where the student athlete has even a more of a risk is potentially can lose that scholarship. And we have the numbers to show how many student athletes who enter the transfer portal, they are on athletics aid, and they don't end up at another institution or end up at another institution not on athletics aid. We can track all of that information. So just to get back to your original question, Andy, you hope that the student athlete has communication with the coach first before even going to the compliance administrator. I do know that's not happening everywhere, but you hope there is that relationship. And then it's going to the compliance administrator, asking for your written notification of transfer. And then the student athlete, if the one-time transfer exception is going to be used for immediate eligibility, that student athlete does have to go through an educational module and be certified that they have gone through that module. And it speaks to what Lydia just said, it talks about the transfer hours and is this really what you want to do, to make them pause and really think, okay, so before any of their entry into the transfer portal, that has to happen. And then it's as simple as compliance enters a student athlete in the transfer portal, student athlete receives an automatic email saying you've been entered, and then open, to speak to any coaches that the student athlete wants to speak to at that point. And then we track that student athlete if that student athlete does transfer. So then their record is marked as matriculated. So then at that point, nobody can talk to that student athlete unless the record shows as active, because there's many student athletes in the transfer portal. The record either shows matriculated or withdrawn, which means they decided to either not continue the process and speaking to coaches, or they return back to their institution on a roster that next academic year.
So who can see the transfer portal?
Well, only our NCAA member institutions can have access to the transfer portal. And then there's different access levels. Like we said, it's very complex with compliance because all they have to do in managing the transfer process and what they have access to. Our coaches, really do have just really their name, whether they were on athletics aid or not, whether they're potentially going to be a grad student or undergrad. And their contact information, as far as only an email address, that's all they have in their sport. So for coaches, very limited access. For compliance administrators, they have a lot of information available to certify that student athlete's eligibility. And as Lydia talked about, student athlete does not have access.
What academics, Lydia, what academics are listed?
Well, the academics that are in the portal for our student athletes are, there's a lot of information about the course, like their overall credits that they're bringing over. But that is really on the backhand side. The coaches are not seeing that. The one thing
they're not seeing the GPA or even the major? No,
coaches don't have access. The other cool thing I think is that one of the things Susan just mentioned is that coaches only have access to student athletes' email addresses. Their cell phone number is not included in the portal. And I think a really interesting point is that it was actually the student athletes who were part of the transfer committee that really designed the concept of the portal. They specifically asked that cell numbers not be included in the portal. They did not want to be bombarded with text. They didn't want to be called all the time. They are the ones who really in many ways kind of helped us think about what should be in the portal and how should people have access to reaching out to student athletes. So I think that's kind of a cool thing, knowing that the student athletes and their voice was really part in shaping what you see in the portal and what coaches have access to. The other cool thing that coaches do have access to, and this is true for compliance as well, as there is a data reports feature in the transfer portal that the membership can look at to see, activity in the portal at the sport level, by year to year. So there are a lot of tools that are already built in to help people understand what's in the portal. They can look at transfers, from one conference to another. That's visible to the membership. That's not visible to the public, but there are some powerful analytical tools built into the portal as well.
One thing I want to clear up as well, Susan, this one-time transfer, help me out here to educate people that it's a clean slate, because we've seen this certainly this last season. Oh, he or she is on her third school, fourth school. That passed, help me out if I'm right here, that it's a one-time transfer now. Even, you may be on school 3 or 4, but going forward, you can't not sit out on 3 or 4. Is that correct?
Yes, one-time transfer is just that. One time you can use that exception to be immediately eligible. If you're going to transfer second, third time, then you're going to have to look at, what are the circumstances that are available to you to receive any other type of exception. But when you're talking about the one-time transfer exception, can only be used once in that athletic career.
So for that being said, I would think that going forward, there will be a little bit of a settling down. We may not see as many athletes play at 3 or 4 schools like we're seeing now, because they will have already used that one-time transfer, and they would then have to sit out or apply for a waiver or an appeal. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, you have to keep in mind too, we haven't talked graduate students.
No, I was going to get there yet.
And so that potentially, if the fan out there is watching, a game and sees that, hey, that student athlete was on that team last year, this team now the third, at some point they're doing what they're supposed to do and graduate, and then they may have an extra season remaining and could use that as a graduate student.
So,
Andy, I think I just want to clear up a misperception. I mean, there are not, we have 500,000 student athletes. There are not that, it's not a sizable number that are multi-year transfers. We just ran the data, and it's only about, if we look at just Division I student athletes that are in the transfer portal, less than 5% of the student athletes currently in the portal this year are those who are seeking multi-year transfers as an undergrad. So it's in almost all sports, it's under 100. In many cases, it's under 10 people across the entire sport. So I think anecdotally, I'm sure you and I could sit down and we could list off, 5, 10, 20 student athletes that are multi-year transfers. But I think it's really important to, if you take the 10,000 foot level, we're talking about a very, very small population. At the same time, they're highly visible. And so yes, the anecdote is definitely something we all can see, and we can all come up with a name or two. But it is not something that we're seeing. 95% of student athletes who are entering the transfer portal are not multi-year transfers. So I just think it's really important to be clear about that.
Great point. There were just a couple of high profile teams.
Absolutely. Yep. Totally.
All right. One last thing before I get to postgrads or graduate students. May 1st. May 1st is a deadline that's been out there, but May 1st has always been sort of this date. If you want to play in the fall and winter, there are different dates during the year of when you need to be eligible for that following season. So tell me about what May 1st means into the transfer portal of being eligible right away, Susan and Lydia.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's I would say misinformation too, because it doesn't mean that if a student athlete requests notification of transfer on May 2nd, that they can't transfer. That student athlete could still do that, but would not be eligible now for the one-time transfer exception. So, the deadlines that were established last year with the one-time, and they only apply to the one-time transfer exception, to use that exception for immediate eligibility. I mean, that's, those deadlines really were established to, maintain some control over the transfer environment for coaches and to be able to distribute that athletic aid for those student athletes, and for the student athlete to have, a vision of where, that they're going to attend the next fall. So yeah, the deadline is fast approaching for those sports that have the May 1st deadline, but it does not mean that a student athlete could not transfer. It's just you cannot use the one-time transfer exception.
Right, without obviously trying to go through some sort of appeal process. And look, I mean, these institutions have their own deadlines of when tuition is due in August or July. So, I mean, they have to obviously have their student body. So it's not just the coach that needs to know his or her roster by a certain date. I mean, these are massive institutions that need to know when their students are arriving. All right, so let's deal with graduates, because this has also been an evolving change in terms of graduate students being eligible right away. And, is the major there? Is the major not there? And, that aspect of the transfer portal, for lack of a better term, where do the graduate students, they've got their degree at this institution, now they have another year of eligibility. What's their path?
Yeah, we've definitely seen a real uptick, particularly in sports, in many of our Olympic sports, in students who do have that additional year of eligibility, likely due to the COVID, eligibility extension. Many of these students are pursuing pathways as graduate transfers. If you look at that dashboard I was just talking about, we actually break out for you, every sport. You can look at the total number of transfers, both undergraduate and graduate. And we see that, many of our sports, the numbers for undergraduate transfers look really similar in the most recent year to the previous year, but the real growth was in the graduate transfer opportunities. And I think, that's very similar, thinking about how we would talk to an undergraduate in our family, someone wrapping up their degree at one institution. We often encourage people to pursue a graduate education at another school. It's just a new opportunity, a new chance to be a part of a new campus, to learn from new faculty members. I mean, that's what you would typically counsel your cousin, your daughter, in your own family. And so I think, if student athletes are interested in using that opportunity and pursuing an education in another school, it makes perfect sense. And then also continuing their competition. So we did see a real uptick, particularly in sports that haven't had a lot of growth in terms of graduate transfers. And we saw for, overall, when we look at the data, it's still a really tiny percentage of student athletes that pursue a graduate transfer opportunity. Historically, it's been less. It's just around 0.5% of all student athletes are graduate transfers. But of course, there is that larger group, particularly in men's basketball and football. So again, some of those sports that are hyper visible, I think have perpetuated this idea that there's a ton of graduate transfers. But I do think this COVID extension will lead to growth in the graduate transfer space for the next few years, as there is that additional year of eligibility for many of our student athletes.
Susan?
Yeah, I really don't have a whole lot to add what Lydia said. I mean, we are definitely seeing that increase in the graduate student participation. And we really can point to that extra season of competition in that year that COVID offered that season to our student athletes.
All right, last two things, let you go here. Number one, sports. I just want to clear up this as well. There was a time where certain sports were segregated with different rules. Where are we right now in terms of men's and women's basketball, football? I think maybe it was ice hockey that had a little bit of a different set of rules. Susan?
Well, where we're at, all of the sports do have the same rule now. They all have the opportunity for the one-time transfer exception across the board for Division I. And one thing I want to highlight too, because we've talked a lot about Division I because of the questions were associated with that. I mean, the transfer portal is used by Division I, II, and III member institutions. They do have different set of legislation that's applied to their transfer situation. So just want to make sure, because we did mention the May 1 deadline, for example, where Division II has a different deadline. They have June 1 as their deadline. So there are different rules that come into play for different divisions. So I just wanted to make sure that we were clear on that, not to confuse people, that it's a transfer portal used for all three divisions. It's just, it started with Division I when Division I changed their legislation.
It's not going to be a surprise. People have asked Susan and I forever, when are we going to see what normal looks like in the portal? And we originally, pre-pandemic, we said, oh, just give us 2 years, give us 2 or 3 years of good data. And then there was a pandemic that has lasted for over 2 years. And so we're continuing to see that also kind of confound some of the normal trends that we would expect to see in the transfer portal. And so I think that's one of the challenges, is that we all need to be patient when we're looking at, what does normal look like in terms of transfer, especially given additional changes in legislation like this opportunity for the one-time transfer exception. So there's just multiple, new factors that are shaking up the transfer landscape, which I know is putting a lot of people on edge, but in order to really see trends and have some good understanding of what's happening, we're going to have to be a little patient.
All right. So for those that want to find this information, where do they go?
So if you're interested in the new dashboard that's public facing and really talks about the number of student athletes who enter the portal and then have success in transferring, if you want to look at just the overall number of students who enter the portal and the months of their entry or the overall outcomes, that data is available on the ncaa.org/research page. We do have a transfer page there. But the other neat space that we've placed it is on the ncaa.org heading website. There is, under the student athlete tab, there is a section that says want to transfer. And this new dashboard is under the NCAA resources, which I think is hopefully, by being placed there, it's a nice way for both student athletes and their families to have access to that tool.
You get the last word, Susan.
Well, I think the last word is, don't be alarmed by the number that you see entries into the transfer portal, because that is not the transfer number. That's just those student athletes who have opened it up to discuss possible transfer with coaches. It's, the actual matriculation number, those are the student athletes who actually transfer, which is actually a much smaller number.
Well, this was great. Highly informational, educational. I appreciate Susan Peal and Lydia Bell for all of their time and effort that they're putting into this. Across all divisions, as Susan was saying. As always, you go to ncaa.org/social series, where all our social series are archived. We're here every week, diving into the big issues across the entire membership. Thanks for watching, everyone.